Hi everyone, this is Kaylee Bateman for Mixing Light, and today I am thrilled to be talking with esteemed colorist and colleague of mine, Daniel Stonehouse, who has been colouring in Melbourne since I started and probably well before. And we were always very aware of one another as we were coming up, and is now the founder and owner and colorist at Crayon, which is a studio that is also representing myself. So full disclosure, everyone.
Nepotism alert.
Yes, that's right. So I'm very thrilled to be on the books at Crayon now. And Dan and his team have made me feel extremely welcome and have looked after myself and my clients very, very beautifully through the transition. So I've been a Crayon colorist now for coming up to 6 months, which is hard to believe.
Wow,
how quickly that's
6
gone.
months already? Amazing.
Yes, it must be coming up soon. And so, yeah, just absolutely thrilled to have Dan here today to talk to me about running a boutique colour shop that not only has a physical presence in Melbourne, but also is remotely representing a growing roster of colourists, including myself, and doing a beautiful job at it. So welcome, Dan, and thank you
Happy
so
to be
much
here.
for joining me. So I'd love to know, we came up together. I remember always seeing your work as a junior and an aspiring colorist and thinking, wow, this guy's got it, and how does he do that? And I wish I could do that, and always being slightly jealous, as one is.
Well, look, vice versa. I can remember a particular music video that you did, I think, for Courtney Barnett, if I'm remembering properly.
Oh, yes.
The very gritty, dark one in the caravan. And I was like, why didn't I get to, I do all this bloody happy, shiny, colourful stuff, and you get the dark, bleak, depressing one. Why didn't I get to do that? So yeah, I think we're of a similar generation, and a similar set of experiences is coming up. I always date my start to about when Apple Color came out.
Yes.
I'm sure a lot of people in my generation do too. I always think of that as sort of being around the time the Canon 5D came out as well. And those two things are quite linked, that there were all of a sudden lots of new DPs and directors, and also lots of new colorists. And we all sort of worked together in the early days, doing our best with Canon 5D footage,
That's right. Yes, it was the beginning of the democratization of color grading, I suppose, because, all of a sudden there were new emerging cinematographers who had this sort of easier entry into the market, didn't have to buy $100,000 camera to start shooting. And so they were able to work with people who weren't as established, like yourself and myself, giving us the very important 10,000 hours that we needed to become good at this crazy old job.
And the fun task of just seeing what we could do with fairly low bit rates, H.264 footage.
Absolutely. And I remember those days, the sort of the digital revolution was happening, and there was a new digital format every sort of other day. And I remember being given hard drives and told, hey, we need this in the system tomorrow. And you'd be like, oh, well, there's no programs that I know of that can read this file format, and it doesn't seem to have timecode or real name. So it was a period of great trial and error and stick-to-itness, I seem to recall.
Absolutely. If I scroll all the way back, I'm one of these people that has my iPhone photos going back, pretty much to the dawn of time. But there's a particular image of one of the older Apple Cinema displays with an early version of Red Cine on it, holding up an iPhone, a very early iPhone for some banking ad. So, we were trying to work out how to use red footage and how to transcode it and how to get the best out of it. Before you got it into the grading system, because you couldn't work with the RAWs. And it was a time of a lot of experimentation, a lot of learning, for everyone.
Yes. And I
Um,
think it produced people who are good problem solvers, didn't it?
well,
And
you
who are
had to
willing
be.
to sit down and just nut it out. But
Mm.
just for the listener or the audience out there, so to give a bit of context, would you say this is roughly sort of 15 years ago that we're
I mean,
talking?
I've been saying 15 years for probably longer than 15 years. I should really get my dates and times straight. Look, I think Apple Color came out around 2007, which was a big deal because Apple just bought the whole company and chucked it in with the Final Cut suite. And so all of a sudden you had, like a commonly available program that could do secondaries, that wasn't just the old three-way color corrector in Final Cut or whatever After Effects like to think of as color tools, So all of a sudden there was this readily available program that was enough like, the big things that the post houses were spending millions of dollars on, where you
Mm,
could actually really sink your teeth into and learn the craft.
mm,
I mean, so I had worked in an animation studio. I was working in an animation studio at that time that was sort of had evolved from being very scrappy and doing some production and doing some animation and basically winning jobs and saying yes to things and figuring out how to do them on the fly. So I definitely graded footage before without really knowing what it was. I'd
yeah.
taken stuff and made it look better. But then all of a sudden there was this sort of context to do it in. And it just really felt like a great fit, like
Mm,
the time scale, the collaborative nature of it, the fact that there wasn't really a right answer, but there were answers that were righter than others.
mm,
Yeah, I just sort of did it and did more and more of it and fell in love with it and realized that there was like a craft depth there that I could quite
mm,
happily explore for a really long time. Um, yeah, so that was kind of my start. And, working in an animation company, it sort of started to not make sense to say, like, oh, hey, we're so and so and we represent animation directors. And then there's Dan, who does all this other stuff as well. So my employer and I decided to start a sort of a sister company that I'd be a partner in. And around that time as well, my a building was bought that we're still in to this day, and that was a big part of sort of the birth of Crayon as a company. We were big fans of Bean in Sydney, Ben Eagleton and Andrew's company. They were very forward thinking.
yes.
They were doing things like
Yes.
sending hard drives to clients, like they'd send a big RAID over so, you could get the footage on something fast enough to work with. And they just had this very sort of modern and nimble kind of brand and reputation. And that was a big inspiration for
Mm,
us. In some ways we were trying to do a version of that in Melbourne, but with a colorist who was a
mm.
little bit less experienced, which was stressful, for me, but stuck at it.
So
Yeah.
Bean is a company in Sydney, Ben Eagleton and Andrew Clarkson.
Mhm.
And if anyone listened to my interview with Fergus Rotherham, those are his mentors.
Mm, mm, mm.
And if you're Australian or potentially anyone would know Ben Eagleton's work, I'm not sure if Bean was before or after Ben's stint in LA. Do you know, Dan?
I can't remember the exact timeline of it, but
They had a
they
beautiful
they
reputation
did, they
and
did.
still do to this day,
Mm,
even though I don't believe Bean is still the same scenario that it was.
mm.
Ben is freelance now, and I believe he has just BE. Although I may edit this out because I should get my facts straight before I open my mouth. In any case, they're colorists who have had a huge impact on the Australian industry and also in terms of philosophy to be role models. I think that
Mm,
generation of colorists were role models for mine and Dan's generation coming up, they were people that we could say, well, look, here are people who are really doing it to a world-class standard, and you know, there's absolutely nothing that can go wrong if we aim for that.
And I think to us especially, they represented a new way of doing things. You know, I never worked in a post house. I sometimes,
right, that's good distinction actually.
yeah,
Because
like I sometimes
being
joke.
a boutique.
Yes, exactly right. I sometimes like to joke I've never been in a grade before because I haven't. You know, I was definitely of the generation that was sort of completely self-taught, and you know, I can remember, you know, in the early days, the other colorists I encountered, you know, like on one hand, I could count them, and some of them wanted to talk shop and some of them didn't. Some of them very much didn't, you know. So that was also, that's sort of another thing that shaped my thinking is the difficulty of sort of doing it on your own, and the solitary nature of our work sometimes, and how to sort of encourage solidarity and sharing, and sort of escape the competition mentality, you know, that crafts people can sometimes have with others in their field, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm not
Yeah.
even sure if I
I
answered
think
the question there. We've sort of gone off on
no.
all kinds of tangents.
No, I think there's a few really interesting points there because, you know, we touched on it earlier, that you and I had a bit of healthy jealousy of one another. And I think that's part of being in the same generation as your colleagues. And, you know, especially in Australia, sometimes you can feel like there's quite a small pie and there's not enough slices to go around. And, you know, there's always people with opinions about whether or not you can or should be pursuing this very niche career. And some people aren't particularly shy about letting you know whether or not they think you have a place in the industry. And I don't know whether or not that goes away or whether or not you just develop a tolerance and a thicker skin to it as you mature. But it is something that can shape you as a colorist, and you know, whether or not you get one of those coveted assisting roles in the big facility or not, there is a pathway there, and not everybody needs to do the same color job or have the same approach, because if we all did, you know, every client would also have to be the same, and they're not. So, you know, there was definitely a niche for Crayon in the market that you found, and modeling it on Bean, like what a great company to say, hey, they're doing it, let's do it too. So, you know, you really did go straight into that boutique market and dealt with the challenges that anybody has coming up, which is, you know, how do I find somebody who's willing to teach me, and how do I teach myself, and where do I find those resources? So, you know, did that, what kind of effect did that have on your sort of approach to grading or your philosophy around grading? Did that shape that at all?
Going back even further, you know, I've always been the kind of person where if I'm interested in a subject, it just becomes all consuming, and I will follow my taste. I'll explore it, and you know, I'll usually, there's a famous Ira Glass lengthy quote about creativity, essentially being that the problem is when you start, your taste exceeds your ability, and maybe you actually never catch up, you know, in some ways. But you can get a bit closer after after your 10,000 hours. You might admit to yourself that some of your work is actually okay. But yeah, I guess in high school I got really into photography. I was a terrible skateboarder, so I got into photography so I would have something to do while everyone else was doing more impressive tricks than me. But then that led into working as a photographer, shooting local bands, working for street press and things like that. Funnily enough, to the point where I felt quite jaded by about sort of 16 or 17. Like I'd been spat out by the industry, and you know, $50 for film and a name on the door wasn't quite enough anymore. And then I sort of followed my interests into graphic design. Similar kind of thing, just sort of got quite obsessed with it. Self-taught, thought I was going to study design out of uni, but then maybe didn't realize that those courses were actually quite hard to get into. I was a little bit cocky about my chances. But my point being that when color came along, I'd sort of been in this, I don't know, like this long period of finding new loves, new crafts, and teaching myself about them. So in that era, resources were very scarce. I was saying to someone the other day, like there was that one blue book, The Art of Color Correction. Did you ever see that? Mm-hmm. It was about the only thing.
The Alexis Van Herkman one, right?
A classic of the genre, of a very small genre.
Everyone's got it.
Yeah, but I mean, that was like, I don't know, that was like discovering treasure or something, because, there'd be the odd tutorial or the odd website, and you'd pick up bits and pieces, and you'd read manuals for software, like they were novels, hoping someone had slipped in a little bit about, the actual work we were doing, not just the technical, but the process, the whys. That information was extremely hard to find, but there were bits and pieces here and there, so I guess I just sort of took that kind of quiet desperation and kind of hunger for education, and I just hoovered up absolutely everything I could, and would piece bits and pieces together and just try and make it work, you'd get a little hint about a technique, like, and you'd implement it. You'd go, what the hell is Cineon space? Oh, okay, it's how film scanned. Why is it so soft? Oh, you've got to use an S curve. You just piece all these things together, and put it together. But yeah, there was pretty slim pickings in terms of resources for learning.
It was, wasn't it? I seem to remember it was FX PhD that blew the lid off it for me, because I'd always had this interest, and I'd been looking for, ever since I was at uni and got to go and get my films graded at, what was it called? That place in South Melbourne, where Vincent worked. Oh. No, it wasn't Fats. Complete Post.
Complete Post, with, of course.
Yeah, Dean McClellan and Vincent Taylor were working there, and a bunch of other amazing colorists were working there. I know. And I remember Dee graded this really terrible zombie movie short film that I made, and she made it look so much better. Mm-hmm. It was shot on mini DV, and she made it look like it was something. I remember thinking, my goodness, how do you do that? But like you, I was sort of out there on my own going, where do you find the information? And I think now with, websites like MixingLight, and the availability of being able to reach out to actually ask colorists internationally on, panels and social media, and just how sort of global it's become and how accessible it's become. It really was a different world when we started out. Yeah. So I'm just like having major nostalgia.
A secret society, really, and you were sort of knocking at the door, like thinking you were wearing the costume the right way, and then being scared that you weren't, and that you weren't going to get let in. That's right,
and they come out with the stonecutter's handshake.
But I mean, it's still something I sort of tell people these days, especially younger people who want to break into the industry, who want to be a colorist. Like, the trick is really just not stopping,
absolutely.
There's no other way to do it apart from that. Like, you are a colorist until you tell yourself you're not, and inevitably opportunities will come your way with persistence. But I mean, sometimes it takes a lot of persistence.
Yeah.
it is certainly a bigger field than it was. And, the sort of customers, the consumers, the clients, like have a much better understanding of what it is we do and why it's necessary. Um,
Mm.
but, we're still specialists,
Mm.
so really persistence
Yeah, I
is
mean,
the
in the early days,
only thing you can do.
yes, I couldn't agree more. And not listening to the people who tell you that you shouldn't or can't, and,
Mm.
getting back up when you fall down is all a major part of it. I'd say maybe 80% of it.
Mm.
Um, but I mean, just thinking about the difference between then and now, you certainly wouldn't have had a client pull out Resolve on their laptop or iPad and, grade a couple of shots in your session and say, hey, can you make it look like that? It was a lot more secret.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the systems were extremely expensive. And yeah, fortunately, Apple Color came out and gave you that in. And I mean, it's all about the color, not the tool, right?
Mm.
So if you're an amazing colorist, it doesn't matter what you're in. It doesn't matter what tools you're using. You're going to get results that are pleasing, whether it's in Apple Color or Resolve
Well,
or
yeah. I mean,
Baseline or Nucoda.
you're grading with your brain and your eyes, ultimately,
Mm.
sometimes dismissively mostly when I'm trying to encourage editors to use DaVinci Resolve, I jokingly say it's just rectangles in a row, right? Like, does it, like, does it really matter what program you're using? But color's kind of the same. I mean, look, there are niceties to different systems. There's performance benefits. There's, some tools that are just brilliant and wonderful and open, and other things where you find yourself little dead ends and cul-de-sacs. But ultimately, it's your eyes and your hands, and your brain. Those are the tools you're color grading with, and you can adapt. Like, no one likes that period of time where you're like, oh, I know there's a button for this somewhere, I just don't know where it is. That's never a fun week. But that's not really the big problem of our work, right? The big problem is like, why? Like, why are we doing what we're doing? How are we corralling all this sort of technical knowledge and this instinct and, perception and taste? How are we corralling that all into sort of getting from one end of a project to the other, successfully, with happy clients who feel listened to and like they've participated? That's really the tough part. Probably tougher than the more obvious part of technical knowledge, But yeah, you just have to keep on doing it, and then eventually you hit a point where you're like, oh, this is less stressful than it used to be. Not always. Every now and
That's
then,
right.
you have a day or you have a week or a project,
Yes.
but mostly
Yes.
it does get better. But yeah, hey, these are
It
just
certainly does.
yeah.
So tell me about like how you transitioned from colorist and partner in a sister company to an animation studio, and then had this current iteration where Crayon is yours and you're an artist, but you're also the business owner, which I have to say, from the side of somebody who's represented by a company, it does have a different feeling to being represented in a business where the kind of top-down ownership is an artist. It feels a lot different to the top-down ownership being more producer or production-based. Not to say that one's better than the other, but it certainly has a different flavour, and it is quite lovely to know that it's the artist concerns that are the most I don't even know what the right word is, but they're top of mind, really. Artist concerns are top of mind. How did you find Crayon's current iteration?
Yeah, it was an evolution. I mean, there's some stuff that's just sort of in our DNA. So, Crayon was originally founded by a director who became an entrepreneur, who and a colorist. And I think the idea was to create a space that clients actually wanted to be in,
Mm.
To, you'd hear like a lot about people going to the big name post houses and essentially not having a good time, and we wanted to be sort of new school and nimble and leverage that our experience, like our background and experience was broader than just color, that
Mm.
we both had design backgrounds essentially, and we sort of use that sort of foundational way of creative thinking. We could sort of translate that into different jobs, but at the same time, it's like someone needs you to typeset a title, you can bust out the old design skills. You don't have to go, okay, well, you need half a day in smoke and that's going to cost you, and your producer needs to talk to my producer. Like, we could just be a bit more nimble and fluid, and kind of client friendly. So that's in our DNA. And then sort of the evolution of the business, my business partner ended up heading overseas and starting an absolutely huge, successful tech company, which definitely took up most of their time. So there was a period of time where Crayon was sort of just, it was what it was what it was designed, and it was continuing in that direction. There were some times where we dabbled with representing editors for a while, and sort of being end to end. But we also always sort of came back to this idea of being, what we like to call these days color focused, right? That it's not only color, but it's a business that's sort of focused on that part of the process and the things that surround it. And after a few years of me being the only colorist here, I started to think really heavily about new models for how Crayon could grow. We were in a world where almost every colorist in Australia was freelance. There was a time where I'd joke and say, like, I'm the only colorist with a job left, because the industry,
it is true.
The industry had sort of, we'd left that big post-house era, and we were in a new world where everyone was freelance, and so everyone was sort of on their own, and already kind of at times lonely, or at least, individual job. Sort of, I felt like we were getting broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, and I think there was some good stuff, some that was lost in the move away from the big post houses.
Yes.
Like
I
a certain
agree.
amount of like just pressure caused by money, caused by costs, caused by the costs of the rooms, the kind of rock star mentality. I think it's good that we've sort of moved on from there. But, we sort of threw out a whole bunch of stuff at the same time. Like, we threw out institutional knowledge. We threw out, the glue in between all the stages. You see it now sometimes where like in an ad agency, for example, will sort of throw an editor, a colorist, and an online or a flame or a smoke artist together. And it's sort of like, that's not a post pipeline for a job. Like, I mean, we're used to it and we can talk to each other and we can make it work, but it's not the same as, the glue that holds it all together. And I mean, I think another thing was I'd always had the benefit of having a producer my entire career. I had some form of producer. In the early days when I was dabbling, we had people who, like, I never had to send an invoice in my entire career, which was a great luxury. And as the industry sort of gotten broken down into freelancers, I was like, how do people do it? Like, how do you do a stressful full day in a commercial, and at lunchtime the job from yesterday is hassling you about a new shot, and someone wants to shift a booking, from tomorrow to the day after, meaning you have to shift another book. Like, I just didn't understand how it was possible. And certainly it is possible because people do it. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's also not a skill set. Like personally, that producing skill set, it can seem easy when it's being done well. And, you know, I came up in facilities and I was used to producers who were very, very good at their jobs, managing everything. And so you would think, well, what's the big deal? It can't be that hard. And then, of course, when I had to start doing it for myself, I was like, oh my God, this is really difficult. It's a full job with a full set of skills that aren't in my wheelhouse and I've never learnt. And I just don't even know where to start. Like, put me in front of an Excel spreadsheet and I'll, you know, I'm a bit better now, but at the beginning I was like, I felt like a newborn baby. Like, what do I even do here? Where do I click? So, you know, and those are the sort of things that you don't think about, but recording, you know, and this is like a little bit in the weeds, but when I was doing my own producing, I would always do the bare minimum that was required to secure a booking and then invoice at the end. But I didn't take down job names properly or the names of people who were in the suite. So when it came time to be like, oh, wow, I did this thing and now it's been released, how do I go about promoting that on social media? Well, I don't even remember the director's name. So now I've got another big job of trying to work out and backtrack and retrace my steps and, you know, just those systems, right, that producers just think to do in the moment. I learnt a lot doing it myself, but I never got good at it ever.
It's impossible to be good at it as a busy colorist, right? Because it is a specialist skill and there's just not enough time in the day to do it effectively. And as, you know, our lives change and we get older and we have kids and all the rest of it. I mean, I just sort of saw things being made very difficult for people in our role. And I guess I wanted to think about, like, how could I add people to the roster? How could I grow the business? But also, how could I make that a fair exchange? You know, like, what can I offer colorists? What can we do together that is impossible on our own? You know, so I was very, very lucky in that I met an incredibly talented young colorist, Abe Wynen, and I had a theory about a business model that was sort of, you know, still allowed the colorists to be, you know, like their success to be connected to money, to you know, to not be this kind of old model of like, here's a salary and then we're going to work you to the bone to make that money back, you know. So yeah, an experimental model. Abe came on board and this was sort of around the same time where I took over the business fully. And all was going great, and then of course COVID happened about a bit less than a year after I'd fully taken over. So that was fun. I mean, look, especially in Melbourne, where we were. I don't know. I think in terms of like lockdowns and, you know, stopping of work and all that kind of stuff, I think we were one of the more impacted places around the world by COVID. So that was obviously a bit of a setback. You know, when when you're not allowed to leave the house, you're obviously not shooting TV commercials. But, you know, we got through that and we're even able to grow a little bit, adding producers, working with 2 colorists, and just sort of like push things forward from there. The model seemed to be working. You know, Abe's career was just absolutely taking off. You know,
I would like to talk about Abe a little bit, just as a sideline, because he's somebody whose work I really admire. and he seems like a really nice person as well,
Absolutely.
which I think goes a long way. And he's actually somebody I'd really like to speak to for
Yes,
this
he'd be a great person to
series.
speak to. So he's over in Canada now.
Yeah.
He's a senior colorist, which,
Yes.
look, to be honest, personally, is a term I've never liked, because it's sort of, to me, it implies a wise old man or woman,
Oh, like a Gandalf type.
like you're shaking your fist at clouds, maybe. But I mean, hey, if you're going to be a senior colorist, I'm pretty sure before he's 30, that's probably a pretty good
Oh,
title.
I know,
Um,
unbelievable. I can only think of one other person who's pulled that off, and she
mm,
also was a Toronto-based
mm.
colorist.
Ex-Melbourne, Toronto-based
Yes,
colorist. There you go.
exactly.
I know.
Yes. He's
Um,
absolutely kicking goals for anyone who
yes.
might know the secret code. But Abe has recently taken on the heading up the Colour Society International
Yes.
Canada chapter
Yes. Yeah. With
with
Eric.
the
With Eric Whip,
esteemed
another
Eric
guy, a
Whip.
good guy to be hanging out with.
Yes.
Yeah.
So congratulations to both of them.
Yes.
And, congrats, Abe, if you're listening, for
Yeah.
just, kicking so many goals. I'm really following with interest all the cool stuff you're
Yeah.
doing.
An incredibly talented and dedicated colorist. And I'm super proud to to have like kind of to work alongside him and to share ideas and to learn from each other. And yeah, super proud of everything he's doing now. Um, but yeah, so that was sort of an experiment that worked.
Yeah, very
I had a
successful.
model that I could see a future in. And then the next challenge was thinking about um, I guess one of the problems of our industry has always been that it's traditionally local, right? Like, and that
Mm,
goes back to the big post house days where, um, you'd spend $1 million or $2 million fitting out a room, and people would come to it. Local
mm,
people necessarily would come to it. Um, but in a modern world, it's interesting to think about like how you break down those geographic boundaries of our work, right? It's happening organically. The COVID time sort of advanced it. Um, but we don't have to be limited um, by our location anymore. Um, Either where the colorist is based, where the clients are based, and as we're learning where the production team is based versus where the colorist is based.
mm.
Um, so I spend a lot of time uh, thinking and planning and building infrastructure that would, again, like I always wanted this to be almost a collective, right? Like to a way of pooling resources, pooling connections, pooling influences, to sort of be able to, for colorists to be able to sort of achieve more than they could on their own. Yeah, so spent a lot of time planning workflows and kind of boring database infrastructure and things like that, just to allow that to work. And it's been really thrilling for me to see it working.
That's one of those things that not every colorist is interested in. And
Mm,
it's something that, as a freelancer, because I'm tech savvy to the extent that I need to be, but I'm certainly not excited about SQL databases. And it's just not a itch that I feel a need to scratch. And I think that's one of the things that was lost in the move to freelance was that IT department that the big facility had that could go and glue everything back together again. So,
mm,
that is of a huge benefit to the less. It's not even about technical aptitude because everyone can do it, but
mm.
it's how interested you are in it, I suppose.
Yeah.
And if you're not interested in it, then, to have a broader team, and I know that I certainly utilize this on our Slack channels, like, hey, I want to do this, but I have absolutely no idea how. Can somebody who's interested in this stuff give me their opinion? And when you're treating other colorists as competition instead of colleagues, you don't get that cross-pollination. So it is very nice to shift that thinking a little bit.
A pivotal thing for me about that type of thinking, I think you've talked about it with a few other people from Melbourne. We have a really good culture here. The colorists, we get together once or twice a year. We drink a little bit too much. We have some nerdy conversations. We share some mutual grievances maybe and try not to turn it into a whinge fest. But we get together and we talk and we know each other's faces and we know each other's names. And just through that, it really helped me realize that we're not as in competition with each other as we might think. You know, like a lot of it is just sort of the psychology of a craftsperson, right? It's almost like the dark side of appreciating the craft is that, you can get jealous, or you can see other people getting opportunities you want and wonder why it isn't you, or you can see a beautiful piece of work and you could doubt that you'd ever be able to do it. And just through, having that connection to fellow practitioners, that was like a big seed in my thinking, because it made me realize that, especially in the short form world, right, we all have these like intense, hard won, forged in the fire relationships with clients. We're all people's go-tos, like we all have clients who trust us implicitly and, absolutely, are at the top of their list for every job, because we have the power to stuff up a project, like we actually have like a really intense responsibility sometimes when you think about the labor and the creativity that's gone into any project that we get to touch, just the person hours and the care and the sacrifice and, we're the ones who are responsible for making sure all of that turns up on screen, right? And when we're doing well, we actually have the power to sort of amplify that. But at least we have the responsibility to ensure it turns up on screen. So I think we all have these like really intense trust relationships with our clients, and that when you get a group of colorists together who are like-minded, that influence, those relationships, they kind of amplify rather than just stacking up on top of each other. And like a lot of that came from, just those Melbourne meetups with colorists, of realizing that we're, that there's this kind of solidarity there that's really nice. And
it's not something that we, for people listening overseas who have an experience of still having those post facilities or those grading shops that have a stable of maybe, 10 local but possibly 50 international colorists who are at your fingertips. It's not something that in Australia we have anymore. And I think there are pros and cons, of course, to both. But it is nice that, even if you're not in a facility or if you're working as a freelancer or maybe you're emerging in your career, you can try to think of people who are doing the jobs that you want to be doing, not as somebody who's blocking your ability to succeed, but as somebody who can help you get there. Bit of healthy jealousy, a bit of healthy competition never hurt anybody because it helps you raise yourself. But there's a difference, I think, and this is getting a bit philosophical, between going, oh, gee, I wish I did that cool thing. Hey, well done, mate. Like, good job. I loved it. There's a difference between that and the moments that I think we've all had where we're looking at our work and we're going, my God, I just have no place here. Like this is terrible. And how could anybody, possibly want me on their job? And it can be very difficult to pull yourself out of that spiral when you're siloed, when you're just on your own. And you've got no one who you can say, hey, like SOS, I feel like shit. I need to remember why we're all doing this crazy thing that we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So mental health shout out there, but it's just better together, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's not just colorists. I think it's quite common across like most creative industries or practices. There's certain core things like you lack perspective on your own work, or you have too much perspective on your own work. You're just dealing with a different set of information to everyone else. The comparisons are always tricky. Insecurity can manifest as jealousy or resentment. Very early on, I identified like I have this emotional arc about my work, which actually doesn't really happen anymore. But in the early days, it was very predictable. About 4:00, I'd be thinking, okay, maybe I can talk to my producer. Maybe I can start again tomorrow. We'll just throw the whole thing out, like clockwork. About that time, that's how I would feel. And then, the next day I'd feel like, oh, I barely got away with that. And then down the track, I'd feel like, oh, maybe I did get away with it. And then 3 months later, I'd look at it and I'd go, oh, that's pretty, how did I do that? I don't know how I did that, And so you just identify your emotional arc. And that can help you just put it out of your minds, because it all goes back to just keeping on doing the work,
and that idea of getting away with it, I've heard that from other colorists as well that I've assisted. And yeah, I'm not sure how many people have that feeling of like they've just robbed a building as they leave their session, but we've definitely all been there.
We are lucky in our work that there is a tradition of limited time, I think, right?
Yes.
I think that is actually a blessing, although sometimes it can not be. But the fact that it's like, do what you can given the circumstances, given the the individual problems and the personalities of every job. Do what you can, make it look better, and get it done by 5:00, or 6:00, or maybe 7 sometimes. But it sort of frees you from like having to do a perfect job. Like you've got these boundaries, and you've got to do it within those boundaries, and I think it's actually a blessing.
Good pressure on you as well. Like I know that I'm certainly all revved up and ready to go when I know that I've got a 4-hour session and I've got more to do than I can possibly do in 4 hours.
And then somehow you pull it off,
caffeinated, and I am feeling good, and I'm like, we're going to smash this. And if you don't think too hard, sometimes you get out of your own way when you just have to get it done. Sometimes you go, I certainly know that when I've got all the time in the world, I'm there doing what Dean McClellan calls fiddling yourself into a corner, which, I think it's really stuck with me. So you just get out of your own way and let your hands do it. Like you're an amazing surgeon who doesn't even have to think anymore. Just put your playlist on and go.
There's a lot that's been written, about the flow state. And I think we get to spend a lot of time in that state, right? Like
I love it.
Possibly, I don't know what it feels like to be a painter or to be a sculptor, but I imagine we get a little taste of what that's like. As our jobs, and we're getting paid for it. It's pretty incredible. Like we're quite lucky.
Do you have any, just speaking of flow states, do you have any sort of hacks or techniques that you use to get into that flow state? Because I know that when you've got a certain time restriction on your session, you can't muck around for 3 hours and then get into it. You have to get into it.
I actually think that the time restriction is the best one. I used to be a classic procrastinator, a creative procrastinator. All of my school projects were the night before, and I was somehow able to pull it off and do okay. But I think color taught me how not to be a procrastinator because, for one, it's very hard to procrastinate when someone is literally in the room with you, you know, like there's not a lot of like doing your usual lap of the websites you like to check out you can get away with when people are in the room and expecting results. Yeah, so I think the time limits actually really help. Music is a great tool, and to
Yeah.
be honest, it's probably one of the best things about our jobs, right? Like I always feel for
Yes.
editors. You know,
Yes.
we actually get to listen to music while we work, which is
Yep.
incredibly lucky. And we also get to inflict our taste in music on other people, which is always fun too. So, um, certainly there's sort of different types of music I go to at different stages of the process, different times of day. You know, it can get pretty intense towards the end, that little last push before
What's
hitting render.
intense? What's intense for you? Is it
Oh, I
like just
mean, it can get pretty
big
intense, like
beats or death
very
metal?
very aggressive rapping that I have to just make sure everyone in the
Mm.
room knows I'm not necessarily agreeing with the sentiments. You know, like
Kanye said it, not you.
well, yeah, Kanye might be a little bit of a bridge too far these days, but uh, yeah, or like some fairly intense electronic music. Yeah, you know, the start of the day can be kind of instrumental or piano or, but yeah, I think that's always fun too. The room management side of the work can also help you get into that flow state of the actual, you know, work on the tools.
I would encourage you to make a Crayon Spotify
Yeah,
playlist.
or a Crayon mixtape, maybe, you know.
Yes, I would love to hear what everyone else is listening to in their sessions.
Well,
And
look, you could always make a film, and I'll grade
um,
it for you. That's an option. Um,
I want to put that out there to anyone listening as well. If you have a really great grading
mm,
playlist, I would love to know about it because
mm,
I'm the same as Jan, and I turn to music for that flow state, and I'm always looking for something new because I often will reuse the same playlists just to get into the flow state.
mm.
There's one called Unwind 80s that I think I must have listened to
Nice.
like daily for maybe 5 years now.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that is just way too many 80s songs. So I'm
Mm.
looking for something new, everyone.
I mean, even these days, I have like an Apple TV on my client monitor, and I will quite often launch into, you know, a history of the best music videos of the past 20 years, or, you know, if anyone shows a vague interest in skateboarding, it's like, I'll check out these skate videos. But yeah, you know, I think it's they're all like your clients should enjoy coming to see you, right? Like
Yeah.
they should have a good time, and you should gel with people, and you should be able to talk about the references they're talking about, and um, you know, photographers, filmmakers, TV shows, music, culture, art. You know, my favorite references are when people talk about painters or
Mm.
sculptors or you know, because it's not specific and it is at the same time, you know. So I think um, yeah, you've got to be a good host as a colorist as well. That's really important.
My
And you've got
thoughts with
to
painting and photography as references is I love them because they're such distilled ideas.
mm, mm,
You know, when you're given like a feature film as a reference, and it's like, well, which shot, you know, which
yeah,
scene,
how specific are you
which,
being? You know,
yeah.
like are we?
Whereas if you get like a painting, you can be
Mm,
like, well, I can see
yeah,
exactly what you're after here. And we can look at, you know, you can go from there, you can go outwards instead of going
mm,
from something
mm,
large back in.
yeah, yeah. Whenever I'm
I do
given
love a
stills
painting
like
ref.
TVs or TV shows or movie stills, I'm always trying to extract ideas from them. I
Mm.
always prefer it where someone will give me, you know, a folder full of images or a PDF, you know, with a couple of things tiled, and then you can kind of navigate them as a story and take ideas from them.
Mm.
Um, because I mean, this circles around nicely to um, I'm very anti look, right? Like I don't like the idea of looks in
Ah,
grading. You know,
interesting.
I think the look is a result rather than an element of the process. You know, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like if you're sort of, I don't know, I feel like for my work, if I'm thinking about a look, it's like I've got hold of the wrong side of the equation or something. To me, it's like a look is sort of like it's your taste applied to the project in an appropriate way, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Um, and you can certainly have elements or ingredients. You can talk about contrast, and you can talk about saturation and density of colors, and you can talk about techniques and approaches. But the way, like my favorite projects are the ones where my work disappears into the project. Does
Mm.
that make sense? Where um, no one's looking at it and saying like, "What a beautiful grade." I mean, maybe they might say that to me if I'm lucky, but just being polite. But like good color grading really looks like great cinematography. It looks like great filmmaking. Um, so I think I'm always very wary of style. Sort of applied on top of things. Um,
Right.
I mean,
So
yeah.
I would love to explore this a little bit further because I think
Mm,
that it's like a very a philosophy based kind of thing, but also like super tangible to what we
mm,
do. And it's not something that I've really been able to have a huge conversation about before. Um, Often I will grade under a look. So
mm,
I'll have everything grouped, and that group is my look, and I even call it
mm,
look.
mm, mm,
And I'll have, I'll look at the references and I'll use a few tools to generate like a contrast level across the board and maybe like a certain treatment of a primary, like, okay, for this
mm,
look, we've got a deep, filmy kind of ectochromy red, but only in the reds because it's digital and we can do whatever the hell we want. So, you know, then maybe I've got, instead of that kind of like yellow green that you would get in ectochrome, maybe I keep like a nice fresh green that I'll use a
mm,
few nodes or a layer or two to give us that look. And then underneath that, then I'll do the grade,
yeah,
basically.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I'll balance and I'll match, and I might be pushing it in the wrong direction to make it look right under the look. If you were to take the look off, you'd probably go, oh my goodness, what on earth is that terrible looking thing?
Mm, mm,
But
mm,
because
mm.
it's all graded under the look, it's all integrated.
Look,
So when you
I'm
say,
doing the same thing. I'm just probably using different terminology, but so the way I think about it is, gosh, how do I think about it? Okay, so like as a baby colorist, I think your first aha moment, right, is when you realize that to get a bunch of stuff to look the same, you need to do different things to all of it, right? Like we all start
mm-hmm,
out we all start out with looks, right? You know, applying a transformation across a scene or across an entire project, and then as a baby colorist, you then discover like, oh, okay, I've got to go in and balance it all, so it makes sense, and then you start to realize like, oh, okay, this scene needs its own treatment. It's underwater. It's a cool
mm,
moonlit night. It's um, you know, and before you know it, you're sort of doing all kinds of different things to all kinds of different shots or scenes or elements. To get them towards this ideal thing that is the result. Um, so I always try and work from sort of the decisions of broadest impact down to the small details. But I'm also not
mm-hmm,
scared of small details. Like I spend a lot of time
mm-hmm,
on small details. Um, so, like when I'm starting a project, probably the first decision I'll make, it's akin to a look, but it's sort of, I think of it as the transform. Like how are we getting from what was shot to a result that has the characteristics we want in broad strokes, and then I'll usually start trying that out on different shots, refining things, again, broad strokes. And then, then you go through and you start balancing things underneath that. But a lot of what I do, I think, is very photographic and subtractive, right? Is the word I've been thinking of a lot about lately. I mean, there's, like the apocryphal story of like, how do you make a sculpture of someone? Well, you take away all the bits that aren't the sculpture. But I do think about that in my work a lot. Like, I am not scared to jump straight in and put a tiny window in the corner of frame to move something that is very distracting and very much dragging the attention in the wrong place, I try these days, instead of bringing things up, to be taking things away, if that makes sense. And then the other thing I'm always thinking about, like, I think color grading is this dance between, especially in this modern era where, we understand color management and we understand color spaces and, a lot of that kind of color science fundamentals. It's a dance between, people in a room under light over time, and you use that to help things match, essentially. I mean, C mode is one of my favorite buttons in Resolve, which is where it sorts the timeline, instead of, the project order into the shooting order, essentially. And you can use that to kind of, okay, that's why that shot doesn't match. It was actually shot at the end of the scene where the light had changed. But then at the same time, you've got to be comfortable with throwing out that relationship completely, when it makes sense, for the story, for the project, and especially for the relationship. Like I think fundamentally what we're doing is about relationships between shots. Like I think if you imagine, you've always got to remember that this thing will be watched sequentially and that we're the ones, jumping around and looping and jumping from the start of the scene to the end of the scene. You've got to remember that everything we work on will be watched linearly. And so I always kind of imagine this little diminishing graph of relationships between the shot I'm working on and the shots around it, if that makes sense. You can feel the importance of matching kind of trailing off either side of it. So I mean, I think that's something I think about a lot is context and relationships. But ultimately, the big thing I'm always thinking about is story, right? Like, I'm not actually a particularly visual person. I've been in these visual fields my whole life, but I'm very narrative based. I'm very word based. So I think story is like a superpower as a colorist. Understanding filmmaking, understanding the language of cinema, understanding the language of editing, understanding composition and color, and all this great stuff that we absorb from the other craft disciplines. That can actually be your superpower as a colorist, because generally that's the language that cinematographers and directors think and speak in, if that makes sense. As a colorist, if you can understand that, if you can read that, if you can speak that, then you'll have collaborators for life, right? Because they might think of you as a technician, and all of a sudden you're a proper collaborator. Like, you are invested in the same things as they are, and you're making decisions for the same reasons that they are. So I think that's story is kind of a superpower. So I just watch a lot of films.
I love that. So what I'm seeing, and I think this is very much a you thing overall, is that it's a very pragmatic approach to the shot, where maybe if you if you looked at it as like, oh, but there's a look for this whole thing, so this shot needs to have cool shadows and warm highlights, but that's not actually serving the story, or that doesn't look good on that shot, that you're willing to sort of throw out the look and serve the story, serve the shot, as
Absolutely.
long as there's a coherence and a through line that you can weave. So maybe that's something in the contrast, or maybe it's a particular color that can take you through from shot A to shot B over to shot C, even if they have really different ways of getting to that end result.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're not going to be limited by a workflow and go, well, computer says no. That's
No,
it.
I mean, no one looks at your resolve projects, like once it's done, it technique and neatness and proper workflow and order of operations, all of that stuff matters a lot right up to the point where it doesn't, And so I remember spending, a fairly tortured period early on, like wanting to do everything properly. And, I remember I'd often, I did a lot of surf projects and things like that. And so, you'd often encounter footage underwater, and footage underwater never works with a look, like it is, you just have to grade it. The person in one shot can be 10 centimeters further away from the camera and the color of their skin completely changes. It's just how water works, And so like a lot of that water stuff taught me that there are times when you just have to chuck it out and put some nodes in a row, and that's not cheating or lesser or a bad workflow. You're working on images, and the images in the order that they're going to be seen. That's the ultimate result, So, yeah, don't be afraid to sort of chuck it all.
I think that's great. It's sort of that whole thing of learn the rules and then break them. Certainly know why it's important to have one contrast curve or one transform across the board, but remember that it's about your eyes and it's about what the audience is seeing at the end of the day. It's not about how clever you might be as a colorist and all of those really important philosophies that you have drank the Kool-Aid for. Just because that's the style at the time, it might not be. It might not be what's appropriate for the image. So I think that's great advice to anybody. And I know that I can certainly get myself wrapped up in, but like, oh, what if, they cut another version and the shots are in a different order and I better make sure that they match, even if it's making one shot look less aesthetically pleasing on its own. I better really make sure that, shot 2 matches shot 47 just in case.
I mean, look, sometimes you do have to kill your darlings, like sometimes the most beautiful shot in a scene needs to come down a bit to be closer to, the one that's not so great. But yeah, I mean, one of my least favorite things is just being given a bunch of footage out of context and saying like, grade this. It's like, well,
the real?
Yeah. Like how? Well, why?
Yeah.
Like I can,
yeah.
I mean, okay, it's all a bit magenta. I can sort that out, but that's not really what I'm interested in doing, right? I want to make these images sort of speak to each other. And if they're not in order, how can you do that? It's impossible, like you don't have those relationships. And that's kind of one of the most important things.
And one of the things that we haven't mentioned, but is really implicit in everything that we're just talking about, is that, Dan, a majority of the work that you do is in the TVC space, where you have the time to finesse one shot and really work it.
Yes, I definitely came up sort of mostly doing short form. Space. Yeah. I remember,
but you do crossover now.
Oh yeah. I think we're past those days where it's so segregated, which is great. I mean, I've been doing a lot more long form stuff recently, like a couple of feature docos and a couple of feature narrative projects. And I was definitely nervous at first because you look at the shot count and you look at the time you have and you do some maths and a number comes out that just seems ridiculous, and so you ignore it, but you do start grading straight away. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's all just grading, right? Like you can be working on the most technical, dry thing. It still has a story, and it still has a coherence, and it still has scenes. Um, and I think, yeah, all the different disciplines sort of have, um, they use the same muscles in different ways.
Mm.
Um, you have to change your emphasis a little bit. Certainly on a long form or an episodic project, you lean a lot more on structure and on um, uh, setups, and you're very happy when you encounter those things that are just two shots of people talking to each other for a long time. Because you're like,
That's all
wow,
right.
okay, I just graded 80 shots, nice. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think one of the things as I've gotten more experience as a colorist that is hard to put into words. Um, I don't know how I do it, but I just sort of, it's easier to land jobs in the sense that you know you finish on time, or you even finish early sometimes. That never used to happen to me.
Mm.
I think it's just sort of experience and like making the right decisions more than the wrong decisions. Um,
Mm.
Getting caught up less. Getting stuck on small details that don't matter, and sometimes getting stuck on small details that really do matter. Um,
Mm.
it does. I think it just goes back to that idea of like it's what we do is technically very hard, um, and it's a lifetime craft. But it does get easier after a while. Like
Yeah.
if you just keep doing it, it does get easier.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean about landing a project and being surprised when you get to a point where, oh my goodness, we're approved
Yeah, and it's 4 o'clock.
and I'm happy with
What
it.
am I going to
And
do?
exactly. But then it does come out of the blue every now and then. And I had this the other day. I was working on a motion control
Mm,
TVC
mhm,
where they'd shot with a robot arm, programmed camera moves, and they'd done a couple of takes that needed to be stitched together.
mhm,
And there were several versions of it,
mm,
and it
mm.
was all a one take shot.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
But there
yeah.
were maybe eight different versions
Sounds
of
like fun.
the TVC.
Mm.
And I thought, well, how hard could that be? We've only got 16 shots to get through, and we've got a full day to do it.
Mm.
And I was sweating at
Yeah,
5 p.m.
yeah.
going, oh my goodness, I'm going to need more time. And it hasn't happened to me for a very long time that I've had to message a producer and say, hey, how do you feel about me wrapping at 7 instead of 6?
Mm, mm,
Because
mm.
I reckon by the time I finish these tracks, I'm still going to have an hour's worth of handles to do. And it took me by surprise, but I realised, well, I don't do motion control jobs
Mm.
very often, and I've made decisions to put 25 windows into this shot,
And then
and I need
realize
to
there's
get those
17
tracks to
passes you need to track
match.
them through with handles.
And the tracks should match pretty
Yeah,
well.
well, yeah.
And how do you control that? And so, I just had to say to myself, well, next time I'll remember this, and I'll say to myself, this is motion control. Maybe don't reach for the window. See how else you can solve that client
Look,
request.
I'm a window reacher. I always reach for the window. I have weaned myself onto soft ellipses a lot more though. Yeah.
Yes, I love a soft
Oh,
ellipse.
just looks like light, doesn't it?
Getting
Um,
the darkroom tools out.
yeah, no. I mean, anytime you find yourself like semi-rotoing something, you're probably barking up the wrong tree. But every now and then you have to,
Yes.
every now and then.
No, that's so right.
Mm,
But just, you have to know when that moment is. And I think if you're doing similar types of work, you look at something, and after, your 15 years of doing this kind of work, you can say, I know the client, I know the agency, I know the director, I know the DP.
Mm,
I'm pretty sure they're going to want this approach, and you can get cracking
mm,
and
mm,
you can get to a point where everyone's reasonably happy without having to get 2 hours into the session and then completely reorient yourself.
mm,
So,
mm.
you know, there is a lot to be said for just that knowing
Yes.
people.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's driven by the clients as well. Like sometimes they know you and they trust you more, you know?
Yeah,
And so
true. And they're coming to you because they're like, your approach is what I want on this one.
absolutely. Yeah. 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 So
And I think there is a bit of a Dan Stonehouse look, to be honest. I was
well, it is interesting because you know, I do, you know, I am now recruiting colorists. And so I look at colorists' work and I think, you know, I don't look for style, but I think everyone has their tendencies, everyone has their tastes. And if you look at a large body of work from a particular colorist, a good colorist, it won't all look the same, but you'll sort of start to have an idea of their concerns, of the things they think about, you know?
mm,
Um, it's very hard to judge color even as an experienced colorist, right? Because when it's done well, it sort of does disappear. And you don't have the context and you don't have the offline. So, you know,
mm.
you don't know whether it's one of those, you know, just beautiful like passes, you know, I'm trying to think of a sports metaphor here, but I'm not a good sports metaphor person. You know, like a pass
Yeah,
in an
no,
alley
it'd
oop
be over
into
my head
the
anyway.
ball goes in the net or the hole or whatever. You know, because the cinematographer was just ridiculously talented, or the jobs where they've had to do absolute bloody surgery, you know. But if you look at a colorist's work together, you can see tendencies and you can see thought, right? Like you can see a point of view. And I think that's much more interesting than style, you know, like style is a very sort of shorthand way of summing that up, you know, but you can,
Mm,
you can see evidence of like, of original thought or something. Like you can see handprints or fingerprints or something.
mm,
It's a lot more slippery than just style, but there's something there, you know. So that's always what I look for when I'm looking for
mm.
colorists.
I was having a look at some stills from a recent job that you posted on
Mm-hmm.
Instagram. You'll have to refresh me as to the name of it, but it was a collaboration job. It was like Apple and
Oh yes,
am I
yeah,
getting
I mean,
this
I
right?
think it was Office Works first, Apple second, but nonetheless.
Okay. Um, I thought those stills were so beautiful,
Huh.
and I thought, oh, here's another classic Dan grade where you've got really clean, pure, beautiful
Mm.
colors. Like you've just thought, today I'm in love with yellow and I want a symphony of yellow and I want it to be the most enticing, gorgeous yellow.
Well,
And it's not
yellow is the
really a
color I
tone that I've
tussle with the
seen.
most. I think yellow is the trickiest color. Right, I
Really?
really do. I think it's the
For me, it's
narrowest.
magenta.
It's the narrowest, like technically. Um, you know, on one side you have this sort of like yucky green, sort of NTSC kind of crevasse of doom,
Sure.
and then on the other side you have this sort of magenta orange kind of situation.
Mm,
Yeah, actually, I really spend a lot of time thinking about yellow. It's troublesome. I mean, that's an interesting one because
it
that job,
came through.
yeah, right. That job was, I was like, oh, it's a 15 seconder. This is a bit of a stretch. You know, there's not even enough shots to get good stills out of. You know, I'm like, is it really an Apple job? Not sort of, not really. But yeah, no, that's really nice. Again, it's that thing of you just don't have perspective on your own work. You know, like
No.
Instagram is a funny thing to throw your work into because every
Yeah.
now and then something will take off and you're like, okay, and then something you think is fantastic will just absolutely flop. You know. But of course, there's an algorithm you're tussling with that no one really understands, so you can always blame the algorithm. You know.
This is
Yeah.
true. This is
You
true.
posted at
We'll
2:30 p.m., not 3
blame
o'clock p.m. or something.
Meta.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
mm,
So I should probably wrap up shortly, although I have been absolutely loving every second of chatting with you. Um, I suppose before I do, what do you see next for
Mm,
Crayon? And that's a bit of a wild card question, right?
mm, mm,
And also an annoyingly open-ended one. But where do you want to steer this ship
mm.
that you've created?
The thing you still need a lot of money for is a theatre, right? So I could see that at some point in
Yeah,
our future. Because, definitely
beautiful.
as an individual colorist, you're not going to have a theatre. But as a group of colorists together, it's possible.
Mm,
Um, I want to keep on developing cloud workflows, sort of like both official and unofficial. I think, you know, look, it's going to get to the point probably in our careers where we won't have a computer on our desks. We'll be
mm,
spinning up a bunch of machines in an underground lair somewhere with a zillion graphics cards, when we need to render, and half a zillion when we don't. Um, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff still to be done um, with technology, but technology, like, this was something I was thinking about before, but I don't think I mentioned when you were talking about the technology and being nerdy about Postgres databases and all the rest of it. I think colorists are extremely good at thinking about creativity in an efficient way, about workflow, about getting to a good result quickly, right? I think when you take that mentality and you apply it to technology, um, when you really start to think about like how these tools can be used, you know, from the perspective of someone who, like, there are tools I don't use on my panel because it's two button presses instead of one, like that can be the difference between something I use regularly and something I don't, so when you take that kind of
mm,
hyper obsession with like creative efficiency and you sort of start looking at technology through that lens, um, it's not easy to come up with new ideas, but it can certainly be very interesting to come up with ideas that benefit all colorists, right? Like that, whether sort of inside our organization or outside. Yeah, so like somewhat boring tools like databases and things like that. When you think about them through the lens of ease of use and like problems that we keep on facing, um, it's really interesting, productive. So I want to keep on coming up with like tools that people would think are nerdy, but other colorists get excited about. It's
mm,
nice having a,
mm,
a captive audience to appreciate invention in that area. Um,
mm,
and I mean, look, a big part of what Crayon does, which we have not really talked about, is the production team, is the producers, right?
mm,
We have a lot of producers, and we have a lot of sort of technology and infrastructure that allow them to sort of effectively work with a lot of different colorists. And I think that's probably like the secret sauce of what we're doing and why it's working. You know, it's about it's about helping colorists do the things they're best at, and not have to do the things that they're not the best at. But
mm,
it's also about applying that kind of colorist thinking to the producers' roles and to the tools that we use, and how to make that collaboration as frictionless as possible, right? I think that's a really interesting problem to solve. Um, you know, anytime anytime a colorist hits a problem over and over and over again, it's kind of, you can rail against it, or you can sort of turn it into a problem to be solved, or something to adapt to, or a workflow change. And it's sort of really interesting to be able to apply that thinking to to all aspects of the work we do, right? Like that it isn't just about the grade session. It's about sometimes the weeks of discussions and negotiations and planning that happen before, and the stuff that happens after. From invoicing to um, making it easy for clients to pay versus tricky. Like, there's all kinds of technology you
Mm.
can use there to, building workflows to make sure you've generated the stills for the job the colorist really wants to post, and a way of getting that to the top of the list so the producers, can action it passively. Like all this, all this pretty dry stuff I find really interesting. And it's a nice sort of, it's a nice way of using that colorist thinking, but in a different context. I really enjoy it. So
Mm.
lots more
Mm.
of that.
Yes, I mean, from the perspective of somebody who's represented by Crayon, I have to say
Again,
that that's
nepotism alert,
been.
nepotism alert.
Well, I know, but like I never say anything I don't mean, and
Yes.
I'm a bit like I'll say it to your face,
Mm,
but
mm,
um, I do think that that's been one of the main benefits in coming on board as a colorist, as a Crayon colorist, is having those systems in place.
mm.
And it took me a little bit to get onboarded
It's a lot. There's
because, you know,
a lot of esoteric stuff we've developed, but
there are systems, right?
yeah.
And I have to try to understand those systems. And, you know, there are still a few things that I just put in the too hard basket, and I will get to once I have some brain space.
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
to have a team of people who know what you need as a colorist right now, which is beyond just getting the session booked in and paid for, but also um, that you need to have some stills for publicity afterwards. You need to know who to credit in those stills and who not
Mm-hmm.
to. You need people who understand why you may or may not mention a director's version to an agency.
What director's
You know what I
version? Yeah,
mean? Just
yeah,
all
yeah, yeah.
exactly all of those sorts of things. And to know that yes, it's really important for our brain space to see an offline ahead of time, at least the day before, and so we can, you know, be in the shower the following morning and have, you know, those thoughts just going through of like, okay, I see a challenge here, I see a challenge there, I'll be able to possibly use this tool to solve
Yeah, yeah,
that,
yeah.
you
Just being
know.
able to gently sneak up on a project is so nice, rather than like getting
Yeah,
dropped in the hot
yeah,
seat on the day.
yes. Yeah, and I know that when I'm doing my own producing, that's the last thing that I'm thinking
Yeah.
about. I'm just like going in, you know, it's like every day is just putting out fires, spot fire management, and it's like all right, I've got it in the schedule at the right
Mm,
time, and I'm there, job
mm,
done. I'm not thinking about getting the offlines the day before. I'm not thinking about recording any information about the job
mm.
itself. It's just get in there, get out, get it done. Is everyone happy? Okay, phew, what's next? Um, so it is nice to have that sense that, you know, there are people who are recording important information and are thinking about things that I don't want to think
Mm,
about.
mm, 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 mm. Like, who is the name
And
of this
also,
director? that's a that's
well,
a
you know,
classic one.
it sounds stupid,
Yeah,
right? Because like I love the directors that I work
yeah.
with, but sometimes you don't know the people.
No, no, exactly.
Sometimes
Or
it's not the director who's got you involved, you know.
I always
And then you're
say,
sitting in a dark room
yeah.
with people and you don't necessarily get an
No,
introduction.
exactly. I always say it's like, you sit in a room with people, sometimes new people every day, and then you look at a whole bunch of other people the whole day, you know, and then, you bump into someone getting coffee and they know you really well. They know the back of your head really well. And you're
Yes.
just like, gosh, like, what was the job,
Yes.
when did I work with this person before? Oh, that's right. I can always remember the job. So, you know, again,
And we all have to compartmentalize so
mm,
much to get what we need to do
mm,
done that there's only so much that you can actually physically do as one person.
yes,
So
exactly.
yeah,
There
having
are
that
finite
broader team.
resources of an individual person,
Yeah.
and sort of if you try and go beyond that, you very quickly find yourself running a small business, and
Yes.
It actually gets easier in my experience. Like once you get beyond that sort of 1, 2, 3 person scale, um, you
Mm.
know, but having had to go through that myself, I would like to help other people not to have to, yeah, shared
And
resources.
just a quick shout out before we wrap up, and I really do need to go because I have a session about to start, and I'm seeing a message that somebody has actually jumped into a
Oh,
Zoom a
nice.
little
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
ahead
Well, we
of
should
time,
wrap
so
this
I
up.
really must run.
Yes.
But I just wanted to shout out to the other colorists at Crayon,
Absolutely.
and SK McCarthy,
On
who is
Instagram,
incredible.
Sam in person.
It's just what I call him in
No,
my
I
head
know.
because I
I
stalked
have
him for so
directors. I have
long.
directors who I just think of by their like Instagram handles as well. Yeah. So Sam, who's based in Melbourne, with me, Kaylee Bateman, obviously up in Brisbane. Shout out to you. And the recent addition of Max Ferguson Hook, who has just moved from London to Auckland, who we're all very, very excited about learning with and
Lovely
from, and
fellow who used to be with Time Based Arts
the
over in
esteemed
London.
time-based
And
arts, I would say.
yes,
Um,
yes. And Dan and Max are currently having a really great time putting together Max's grade
well, I feel
suite.
like I'm
And I'm
costing.
hearing all of that.
I'm sending him towards esoteric furniture. Yeah, but also sending him towards like Facebook Marketplace bargains. So it kind of evens out.
Something Dan's exceptional at, for those
I
playing
do
at
love a
home.
bargain.
So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone's work as we move forward as a little colouring team, little colouring
Yeah.
family. And I do love having this little peanut gallery to say, give each other a little bit of egging on and reinforcing the great work that everyone does, and also having people to help troubleshoot
Yeah,
the
yeah.
inevitable things that go
The,
wrong.
the classic terse message from in the grade about like, have you ever seen this problem before? And then everyone
Yes,
immediately like assembles like
jumps
Batman
in.
to lob suggestions at it. Turn off caching is usually the answer, but yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So look, I better finish up and jump on the Zoom. But thank you so much for joining me,
Pleasure.
Dan. And yes, I'm sure we'll speak again today. But for now,
and I hope this comes
and for
across as a
Mixing Light,
podcast, not just like a rambling conversation between some colleagues, but yeah,
they're the best ones.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
For Mixing Light, I'm Kaylee Bateman, and I'll see you all again soon.
At We Are Crayon
Bye.
on Instagram. Give me a follow. All right, see ya.
Bye.